Welcome everybody. There's actually 4 of us being involved in this presentation. We each bring quite a different perspective. So we've got Peter Davies, the Chief Technology Officer from the Transport Agency. My name's Pat Ryan, and I had a strategic input and acted as a sounding board for the Chief Architect. And we've got Kerry Brown, who's been the solution architect, but also was a pretty serious subject matter expert for the part of the business that we were dealing with mostly. And we've also got our tech lead, Joel Guevara, here. So he'll field the really gnarly questions. He said he wouldn't actually stand up here because he'd have to faint if I asked him to. And I promised Peter Davies and I didn't actually ring each other up this morning and say, oh, what are you wearing today? Even though we've ended up with the same. Just to kick this off, we're going to talk a bit about Thomas Erl. So most of you hopefully have heard a fair bit about service-oriented architecture. Erl has a very distinctive view, and so the first part is really about Erl, and then we'll break into some of the more technical stuff. So just quickly, in this section, I'll cover who Erl is, what was the business opportunity that drove this, and what were the architectural challenges. And I'll then pretty much stick with the distinctive aspects of the approach rather than try and talk about service-oriented architectures generally. By the way, I'll use the term SOA from now on. We can't really talk about all the fine detail of implementation, but we're really happy to take questions outside of this. How many were at Hussein al-Basri's session? Yeah, it was very interesting listening to him talk about that rapid prototyping, because everything he described about how the team was structured and how the work was managed and engaging the business, it just sounded the same, except he was talking about a 3-week time frame, and we were talking about 3 months for each horizon. But otherwise, it could have been, he could have been talking about our project, which I found very interesting. And he also talked about kicking up a fuss at the end. Well, we actually did a movie, but that was after, as I said, several months. Okay, Thomas Erl, he provided the anchoring methodology right through, so we're 2 years in now, and I was really involved in the first year with the methodology. Service-oriented architecture, or SOA, is really, for those of you who haven't dealt with it, is really just about objects that interchange messages. So it's data travelling between things, and that's near enough it. Web services are probably the most commonly talked about way for that message to travel, but in fact that's not required to be service-oriented. Probably the most distinctive thing about Erl's methodology is he absolutely uses a business in view. So this is not about layering systems per se. He's actually talking about how does the business think about its systems, services and products, and how does it think about its information data. I have a feeling personally that he's got to a kind of universally correct answer. So it's a bit like, for me, I came from a whole relational database background. Sadly, I was around when it all started. It has that feel to it to me. It's like it will last forever. And very interestingly, on the plane up with Joel, I was reading Michael Fowler's microservices style, and again, had that kind of moment of, wow, this is the same. So the microservices style, if you read Martin Fowler's paper, he doesn't really talk about how to implement it. He describes the style. Well, Erl talks about how to implement it. And Fowler actually says it's all about smart endpoints and dumb pipes. And that's what it's all about for us too. The other thing that Erl says is if you understand your business in terms of services, it's actually quite an easy transition to the cloud. And we actually practice this and we believe it. It actually works. We used a number of his books as references, and there's quite a lot of them, including one specifically for .NET and Azure, and another one just for REST, which came out while we were actually in our first year of projects. So he answers some very important questions, and right from the start, it's really about people and process. This is not really a technology structure, it's about how you think about stuff. And you discover services by looking at the way the business thinks about itself. So it describes its processes, it describes the data it uses, and that's kind of it. That's where you discover the services. And so everybody starts talking the same language within the teams. What types of service do you need? There's only 3 in the Erl world, and only 2 really play a very active part. The first is a task service, and a task service is a sequence of steps. So it's a little process flow. And they can be chunked. The second is an entity service, and that represents a domain entity. And that's it for the basic way you describe your business in service-oriented terms. He also has another category called utility services, and they're pretty much the non-functional things. So if you need to audit or you need to do authentication or something like that, they are shared. But otherwise it's very tightly structured. And it's only in that layer below the entity services that you get down to all the good ugly old plumbing and APIs and interchanges and integrations and all the stuff that we have to deal with old systems. So the biggest challenge we had was getting people to think in the Erl mode. And it's pretty hard if people have already had some experience with web services and building layered architectures and that sort of thing, to say, no, this isn't really a bottom-up view. It's not looking at your system, and it's not layering services over the top of things so that they're more accessible. Because that's what we're all used to, basically. This is actually about describing what services to have. So that whole task entity breakdown. And probably the hardest thing to realise was that these things are not hierarchies. Now, you don't have a task service that calls a task service. They can be in a sequence and they can be reused. So task services only talk to entity services. And entity services are the things that gather the information and pass it. Entity services can't talk to each other. And entity services definitely can't call a task service. So it takes quite a while, and all our first workshops were, we spent a lot of time arguing about, oh God, this task service got to call another task service. Well, it actually doesn't, and once you get past that, it's actually, you start thinking about it in a much more simpler term, and you have a better dialogue with your sponsors. I just said only and never quite a lot, and of course you have to deal with the real world occasionally, and you may have to deconstruct a problem that just doesn't lend itself nicely, but that's certainly that's a tactical response rather than a strategic. As people came into the team, they basically got sent home with the books. And if they didn't get it, they got homework. And if they really didn't get it, they got to spend Saturday with Joel doing classes in the team space. And just an unending supply of coffee and sugar. I think Kerry almost got addicted to coffee during the first project. So the source of the first big opportunity, and the rest of the talk is really referring to these 2 systems. And there's activity going on in them at the moment. We're talking about a payment service because there was a need to create a better purchase experience for customers on the web and mobile. And we're talking about tolling, which is paying for toll road trips on the Ariwa bypass, and RUP, which is the road user charges for diesel vehicles. So at the moment, if you go to buy RUC units, so you go to pay for some road user charges, you can only do one vehicle at a time, and you can only do one purchase for one payment. And near enough, all of the processing of that is embedded in basically a legacy system. It's pretty opaque. Tolling is very similar. So it's actually a purchased package for tolling. It's a system that embeds all of the, videoing and photographing of number plates and all that sort of stuff, and creating the billing records. But you still can only do one payment and only buy one type of toll trip at a time. And everything's encapsulated. And there are 14 others with this logic embedded in them that we've uncovered. So they all manage payments and payment processing and purchases. So the big opportunity in the solution that was proposed, which started to get the business excited, was to be able to pull that out and make a common payment service. And that could be shared and also mean that we could have the ability to add features and change payment service providers. So I'm going to hand over now to Kerry, and Kerry's going to talk about the actual journey that this went through to develop the approach. Kerry.
Thanks, Pat. Before we get started, we've got a bit of stuff we can give away. So, something completely off topic, something really random. Multi-choice, so not too tricky. Who can tell me when the first McDonald's opened in New Zealand? 1978, 1976, 1974, or 1972? 76. Oh, that was the bonus. There you go. Come on up. Take a little something. And for the bonus? Who had the bonus? 76? Did you have the bonus? Okay. Alrighty, okay. So the fun part over for now. Let's get into the serious stuff. So what I'm going to talk about today is the delivery strategy. I'm going to talk about three things here: the approach to the adoption of service orientation, some of the principles that we use to guide that approach, and a bit of a look at what that program actually looks like. Now, just before I get into that, I'm going to acknowledge Matt Aldis, who couldn't travel to Auckland today. He skived off, put me up here instead. But Matt Aldis was the enterprise architect at the Transport Agency at the time this all kicked off, largely responsible for defining and driving through the process and the strategy. Okay, so how did we approach this? There's three things really. Firstly, there was a realisation, there was an aha moment. We weren't going to become a service-oriented organisation overnight. We were going to be investing in a strategic, long-term journey, a transformational journey. Tricky questions at this point for our key business stakeholders and our IT stakeholders. Have we actually got the appetite for this? Do we believe in the benefits of service orientation enough to actually sign up and commit to this journey? If we realise these benefits, will they actually make that journey worthwhile? Will they make the investment worthwhile? We had to understand that this was going to mean change, a lot of change in three places. For our people, it was not so much a change in the work that we do, but a change in the way that we work. So most of the project roles, the activities, the deliverables associated with these projects were pretty much the same as what we're used to. But to actually be successful with these outcomes required a lot higher level of collaboration. Now, to help achieve this, what the agency has insisted upon is co-location of project teams. Now, we're an organisation that is spread geographically, so straight away some challenges there for us. So we had everyone from our business SMEs through to our developers, our testers, our external vendors, our internal staff, all centrally located within a project space, a dedicated space. From a process perspective, the traditional waterfall approach, project delivery approach that we were used to wasn't such a good fit. We had to adopt a slightly more iterative approach to project delivery. We used business scenarios to drive this through, so gradually building upon and refining our deliverables with each iteration. No over-the-fence stuff. We don't do requirements, do design, do development. We work through, we gradually build upon it. From a technology aspect, the first part of this was really about understanding what sort of technology was required to deliver common and reusable business services. What were the standards? What were the guidelines that were required to support this? The third thing was really an acceptance that it was going to take quite some time before we got to that desired future state. It was going to be an incremental growth of benefits. The benefits were going to come through reuse and through ease of change, and it was going to be quite some time before we got that return on investment. So let's take a look at some of the principles that have guided this approach. One of the key objectives of service orientation itself is to apply the separation of concerns. So you take a great big problem, you break it out into smaller problems, which on their own are actually quite easy to address. Same can be applied here with our journey. We took small, manageable steps, so we had a lot better chance of succeeding with that step, also a lot less risk associated with taking that step. The impact of failure would be far less with a small step than a giant one. So you're probably all familiar with one of the agency's driver speed slogans, faster you go, the bigger the mess. So true. We didn't want to be that big car crash. The second principle was around building to need. So let's make sure we don't deliver business services unless there is a true business need, a true value for these business services. There is no point in delivering business services just for the sake of building business services, just to say we did it. The third principle was around keeping front of mind that what we are building are assets. Now, these assets have a value because they are common and reusable and they're easy to change. These assets can't be reused. Lots of times, unless they're of good quality, they've got to be fit for purpose. They've got to stand up to the length of time that they're going to be out there for us. Now, none of these are rocket science. None of them are made up by the agency. They're something that's been very much guided by best practice. I'm going to share with you at this point some words from Gartner, and I'll give you a moment to read those. I think that this quote actually really sums things up. You hear of so many organisations out there who attempt the big bang adoption of service orientation. Lots of them fail, and those that fail are left with a pretty sour taste in their mouth. They don't want to go back there again. Didn't work for them. So let's take a look at what the approach, the program actually looks like. Now we've got a couple of streams here. I'm going to talk mainly about the services strategy, but I'm also going to touch on an integration strategy. That's something that we're just starting to approach now. So services strategy made up of 5 pieces. The first phase was really about defining what SOA is for the agency. What direction are we going to take? Where do we go with this? How are we going to approach it? So during this phase, we used a starting point of Thomas Erl definition for SOA. We defined what that SOA delivery strategy was for the agency. We took the time to understand that it was about business services, not a technology platform, not an ESB. SOA is not a product, nor is it just a bunch of web services. We already had plenty of web services. They weren't doing what we needed. It was something that was going to take some time, as I said earlier. It was going to be about the people and the process, not just the technology. And in actual fact, starting with that people and that process aspects was a pretty good idea. Our second phase was about learning and about proving, can we do this? Are we up for it? Can we actually get to the other side? Here what we did is we took a real business problem. Now this was a couple of years ago. Tolling, that road that's quite close to here, was in the limelight quite a bit. We were in the papers, we were in the news. Customers were having trouble making their toll payments. What a good opportunity, let's grab that one, let's take it, let's use it, let's learn from it, let's experiment and learn about SOA. Learn about how we can approach delivery of business services and what that approach is going to mean for our people, our process and our technology. Now at the end of this phase, we delivered a fair bit of collateral in the space of delivery approaches, technical standards and things. We had a good starting point. We also had a proof of concept, something that we could show our business stakeholders, stubbed out as it was, something on a mobile phone that they could look at, they could feel, they could see the value. We'd proved it. Now these two phases are very much IT-led. IT decided to cough up the money. In fact, Peter decided to cough up the money. But we got what we needed out of it. We got that buy-in from our business stakeholders. The third phase is about refining, about establishing some kind of a foundation upon which we can grow SOA. So here what we did is we established and refined the processes that we had delivered during the pilot. We tackled some new problems. Can we service enable one of our line of business legacy applications? In this case, it was the motor vehicle register. Can we retrieve vehicle details from our motor vehicle register in a format that could be well consumed by our business services? So those layers sitting above. We also delivered our first set of true business services. Now it was a set of business services for one capability, for payment. But not one service, a set of services. Payment's not just about taking the money from the bank. There's all the other supporting services that are required. Now at this point, IT took a little bit of a step back, the business took a little bit of a step forward. They started to invest some money. We moved into a more partnership role with our business stakeholders. The fourth phase, this is where we are now. This is about building assets. It's about rolling out those first core capabilities, those core services. We've got two big projects on the go currently that will deliver new business services and that will use the payment capability that we delivered in the previous phase. We've got some challenges here. We need to establish governance structures and processes to support this going forward. We need to start thinking about what our service inventory is going to look like, our catalogue of services. We need to start establishing some asset management because these services, they are business assets. They've got ownership, they've got a life cycle, they need to be well managed. So this phase and going forward, very much business-led. We've made that transition. The final phase is going to be all about management, about ensuring that we continue to invest in business services that are well aligned to the business need. Ongoing management of our service-oriented assets. Growing the inventory across the agency. Now, just to start thinking about some of the technical side of this, up till now, it's been about design time. How do we identify, design and develop business services, and what technology should we use for it? What's fit for purpose? So that takes us through the first 3 phases. Now we're at the time we've got to start to consider runtime. How are we going to manage and support these services once they're out there in a runtime environment? What technology are we going to need to support that? Do we need to start thinking about platforms? Do we need to start thinking about ESPs? We're not quite sure yet. What we need before we can go there is an integration strategy. Now, we like to take things quite carefully, slow, small steps. But now is the right time for the strategy. What we're going to do, we're going to define what that strategy looks like, what types of technology we might need to support this environment. We like to try before we buy. So we're going to try this out. We're going to try out those technologies. Once we're happy that we've got something that's fit for purpose, we'll put the foundations in place. And then over time, as our business services inventory grows across the NZTA, we expect we'll grow that technology platform as well, in alignment with that business need. So at this point, I'm going to hand you back to Pat, who can cover some more of the technical challenges that we've faced so far.
Thanks, Kerry. As I said before, when it gets to the gnarly questions, I'll probably defer to Joel, and that will be mostly in the Q&A session afterwards. So I'm going to talk just a bit about how the services were designed and built, and the critical success factor that we feel is the one that really makes or breaks it, and also some ongoing challenges. There are some technology challenges, and in particular, we focus very heavily on the technology platform that we had. So basically, we just stayed in the Windows Server world. And why did we do that? Because we saved a lot of time and a lot of money. We pretty much used out-of-the-box App Fabric for managing endpoints and managing the loading and monitoring and so on of services. Erl himself is, the Erl approach is strictly contract first. So it's all about messaging, not layers. And our middle order, our middle MOM, whatever, message-oriented middleware. Sorry, having a moment there. We just use WCF. We had to evolve processes for testing, and particularly we went right through load testing, security testing. We had to have tools that could unit test long before we had a user interface. And the other thing is we had to start practicing deployment. So deployment becomes a big deal, particularly if you move to continuous integration, continuous build, continuous deploy. So that's part of this ongoing management. So this is getting past the foundation. There's a very interesting thought here for you guys. We think that there's a journey that goes from App Fabric to Windows Server, the service bus for Windows Server, right through to the Azure Service Bus, and that should give you scale for anything. So it is possible that we have deferred the big investment in a separate enterprise service bus forever. But whatever, we got in really fast, and you could argue very strongly that this takes us to the cloud. Now, we actually had a practice at this, and after our first exercise where we had a nice channel agnostic delivery, two different user experiences, we actually popped most of it up to the cloud, and it just ran. Obviously, you have to change a couple of configuration things, but that was it. So because this is very domain information model centric, the domain model at the moment is in Power Designer. It references OASIS CIQ, the Customer Information Quality schemas. We use that to help promote interoperability. The other government agencies in particular, but could be any outside party. The service contracts themselves are represented as XML schema definition files. And for the WSDLs, we actually, and those contracts, we rely on what gets generated out of Power Designer. So then those are referenced, once we've got those schemas and that WSDL, we reference that inside of Visual Studio and we can generate WCF services. So as I said, if you want to know a bit more than that, those words, you'll have to talk to Joel. We adopted WSI Basic Profile with SOAP. Why didn't we choose REST? Sadly, WSI Basic Profile is still the lowest common denominator. And it was the way that we could be confident that we could interchange information at this time. We were dealing across multiple vendor platforms. We were dealing between multiple languages. All the usual pain. Of course, everybody implements the standard slightly differently, even though it's a standard. But REST is definitely a valid alternative, and Earl's written a book that just focuses on REST, and we're going through that whole debate at the moment. Near enough, the number one critical success factor is business domain modelling. So near enough, it's data. That's a hard thing for most of you who've probably been OO programmers, but I'm a database person from way back, so for me it's like heaven has just suddenly appeared on earth. We had a bit of problem developing our enterprise data model because some of it was happening during the projects, and as soon as you get a whole bunch of people in the room who are trying to build an enterprise data model, you get lots of viewpoints. It wasn't too many parties in the sense of having a few beers, by the way. It was just too many different groups of people. And you get a lot of arguments, and you get a whole lot of people with opinions who really shouldn't have one. As that happens, you start getting a lot more abstraction, and you get a lot more complexity. And you start a process where you can't easily have that dialogue with your business using their language. So you stop calling things by their name. You have, financial event instead of payment. It gets like that. It's pretty tricky. It also encourages the development teams to start inventing stuff themselves and bypassing the process. So they'll call things whatever they like to call them. And if you can get away from that, if you can get back to the point that this is the business's view of its business domain, then you're halfway to success. For the rest of it, and the type of challenges we're facing now, there isn't any simplistic answers. It's kind of what you all deal with every day. Practice, discipline, thinking, researching, finding the right tools. You can't get away from that stuff. So we're dealing at the moment with how to maintain service levels, particularly things like performance, security, reliability, as we redeploy services as they're extended, or deploy more into the same space. So some of these services, there's a pretty critical dependency on them. So how on earth do you maintain service levels over time, which means environments and very rigorous testing structures? We also have quite a lot of security for messages, including their content, travelling between the service objects and, in fact, between environments and zones. And one of the things this has caused is a proliferation of security certs. So we're also trying to work out how to manage that. All of these things, we're down we're part way there, so it's worth talking about it to Joel and others. The only way that this really works is this attention on line of sight. So if the enterprise data model and the names for things still stay the business names and they go all the way through the contracts and even the names of operations, then you can have this dialogue that just works. We have all the perennial challenges, by the way, of versioning of contracts and concurrent projects sharing services while they're in development and all that sort of terrible stuff. There are some design considerations, and this is pretty much straight out of Earl's book. Contract first, separation of concerns, statelessness, agnostic, and he's got these principles and you just read them. And you have to read his book to work out how to apply them. If you applied them all, nothing would ever work, by the way. Some of them have a precedence and some may have a greater influence than others, depending on the service you're looking at. We're still considering the best approach for interoperability. Clearly, it would be really nice if we could move to REST, but there's a lot of thinking and a lot of internal system challenges that we would need to deal with. Transaction management in a stateless, sessionless, whatever world is not that simple. You don't have two-phase commit going on. You've actually got to think about compensating transactions. So if something breaks, you have to do the logic to undo it. You've got to send the right message. So there's a quite a thinking process that you go through to make these things truly stateless. And of course the original systems are completely stateful. They're perfectly happy to have these long-running transactions with everything synchronous. And we're trying to unhook that and make it shareable. For task service compositions, we've actually been using Windows Workflow Foundation. It's probably not the ultimate answer, but it does for now. And longer term, we definitely have to deal with pub, sub, and asynchronous processing. So we've got to get into some form of queues. So as soon as you start looking at Windows Service Bus and Azure Service Bus, you start having those capabilities anyway. So I'm actually going to hand over now to Peter Davies. He's the CTO at the Transport Agency, and he's going to talk about how the business has been successfully engaged in this journey. Cheers, Peter.
Thank you, Pat. Hi, I'm going to be talking about how do we go about getting business sponsorship. And I'll be talking in terms of how we engage the business. But there's three areas I really want to cover. First one is where do we start from? The second part is how did we demonstrate our capability and the commitment from the business? And that's a series of steps we've been talking about previously. And then finally, what did we learn from this journey in terms of getting sponsorship? So where did we start from? Well, I joined the Transport Agency 3 years ago, and as part of my role, I inherited a project which was delivering an enterprise service bus, and it was a project which was struggling. And it was struggling for a couple of reasons. One was the size and the complexity of the project. It was gearing up to be around, I think, an $8 million plus project, which we didn't have the money. It was seen as a technology-driven project. I was the sponsor. I was also having to fund it, and that was a problem in its own right. And when we spoke to the business, they didn't get it. They couldn't see what business problem we were solving for them, which was quite key. You really can't get a project running without that. Now, as Kiri mentioned, we have 2 projects with a service-orientated delivery and with business funding. Now that journey, for me, is 3 years. For the project, from when we stopped the Enterprise Service Bus project, was 2 years. So it's a long journey for us, and it's an incremental, step-by-step journey. So how did we demonstrate our capability and our commitment? Well, we did it with 3 projects. The first project was a proof of concept where we discussed what was the business problem we were going to solve. And the business problem we were going to solve was to demonstrate on a smart device the ability to make a tolling payment and multiple payments. And to this and the following projects, we applied a set of constraints. The first constraint was we always had to address a true business problem. The first one was demonstrating the payment. Now, admittedly, it was totally stubbed, but just showing that to general managers, this is what it can achieve, sparked the interest, and as we got the interest, then the money starts to flow. And you get the commitment to support the project or the proof of concept we are running with resources. The second constraint we had, we didn't really want to spend a heap of money because we weren't sure where we were going, so we had to use our existing Microsoft technology stack, essentially. Kept the costs down. We also we had that experience within the organisation and also with our partnering vendors, such as Resultix and Innovate, to help us with that. The third constraint was that we had to do it within 3 months. We wanted a quick turnaround. I didn't want a long project which was going to cost money. The fourth one was the partnership, and I've mentioned that partnership. And the fifth item was, or constraint, was whatever we did, we actually had to demonstrate it. Someone actually had to see something. So that's why a stubbed service was quite adequate. The next project we did, again, was a proof of concept, but it built upon what we'd first done. The first proof of concept demonstrated what we could do. The second proof of concept demonstrated we could take this service, a payment service on a phone, and work it through to our legacy systems. And again, we partnered with Resultix, Innovate, and also brought in Unisys. And we have got a huge investment with Unisys, so they would join us on the journey. And again, the same constraints applied. We were going to demonstrate to the business a payment. And I think we even had a payment going out to Paymark as a test, and we could demonstrate that and show that going for the accountants. So we demonstrated the problem. Used our existing technology stack again, kept the costs down. Each project cost about the same for me. And they all came, total cost was about 700k, 800k all up. So we kept our costs down from being an $8 million gig down to something which was less than $1 million. The time frame, we had hoped to keep to 3 months, but I think experience taught us, and we kept learning. It was around a 4-month. We spent about, I think, 4 weeks up front doing a lot of planning to make it right. Once we had that problem demonstrated, we then got approval to go to our third project, which was demonstrating that we could take this payment service to a production-ready capability. Again, it took 3 to 4 months to do. Partnered with the same people again, so we had the consistency. The business problem we're solving here isn't obvious, but what we are actually doing is having a production-ready capability or a service there meant that the first business project that comes along doesn't have all that upfront costs to develop a reusable service and a quality reusable service. And it gives them that kind of kickstart to when they start their projects. They've got one service already there. And it showed our commitment from a technology point of view by investing in this that we thought it was the right thing. So business investment is reduced for their first couple of projects. So what did we learn? What were our watch points? From an investment point of view, I'd suggest taking this journey, it's like digging a mine. To get to the ore, you've got to invest up front, and that's what we did with our first 3 projects. Once you dig that mine shaft and you deliver that first service and the business starts to join you, you've dug your mine shaft. You have to invest up front in effort and in dollars to get what you want. If you're building reusable services, it's always going to cost you more than any point-to-point solution, which is a bit of a pain later on in your life. But you've got to spend it up front. So you've got to think about it as a mining operation. It costs money to dig that first shaft, but once you get there, you start to hit gold. The second item is projects and quality. I don't know what it's like in your organisations, but when projects run, they're driven by 2 things: dollars and time. And quality takes a kind of second stage, which is a problem when you're building reusable services. No one's going to use a low-quality reusable service. So a change in the project culture was quite key. During our 3 kind of projects or proof of concepts, quality was paramount. We always said, whatever we do, quality comes first. So getting projects or project managers to not worry so much about time and cost over quality is quite a challenge. Which leads to the third point, which is don't trust a project manager and get involved in the planning of those projects. We've got 2 business projects running, and certainly in one we've been heavily engaged in going through the estimating, so they estimate what's it take to build a quality reusable service. And you've got to be in there, and you've got to work with the projects and the project sponsors, because they're business project sponsored projects, these, and you've got to work with them to talk them through why quality is important. You've got to talk to them and in some cases intervene to make sure that they do consider that this is a reusable service. It's too easy just to slim it back, I don't know, the first thing we always seem to throw out in our projects is disaster recovery. I think the next one is quality. So we've got to really focus on that, and you've got to engage them to do that. The other thing around getting involved in the planning of business projects, obviously it's a business project, delivering a business project, delivering to a business problem. So the project itself isn't all about SOA. There's going to be other streams in this project as well around changing business organisation, changing business processes. And there's a tendency, because it's new to project managers, that they'll focus in on this aspect of the project to the detriment of the rest of the project, and it's no good delivering a reusable service when the rest of the project's kind of crapping out all over the place. So you've got to kind of have that balanced view and bring them into the fold. The final one is don't call it SOA. We're just using reusable services. As soon as you're mentioning SOA outside in a business project, it just skews it, and everyone thinks it's new, and everyone thinks they should go on training courses for Africa. And you just got to kind of, it's the language you use and the way you engage with your business is quite key. Now, we've got 2 business projects going right now, and it's really good to see that they're addressing business problems. There will be more to come, but this is where we are on our journey of 2 years. So we are now actually open for questions and discussion. Doesn't have to be to me.
What if you give what actually was the business value, and was it delivered?
So the value for the business is it's starting to enable them to act upon their channel strategy. We know we want to be... a lot of our payments are made, people dial up our contact centre. We'd like them to be able to make payment through a multitude of channels. By starting to build these services that allows us to plug in the new channels, be it if you want to pay your tolling on your mobile phone, or whether you want to do it wherever or however you want, that's what the business can actually see. We're very fortunate in actual fact that we've got one of our business sponsors really kind of gets it, has a channel strategy which wants to kind of make it easy for the customer, so it's all around the customer experience. And setting in these sets of services is going to make it easier for us to plug in any new channels that come along, and that's where they can see that.
Did you also get cost reductions in legacy or simplification in legacy systems?
We haven't pushed this as a cost reduction. We've put this as an enablement project, partly because, like in mining operations, all your costs up front, and the cost savings everyone would have forgotten it by then. So we pushed it for the enablement. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How do you handle the security part? So for channel services, how do you handle loss violation?
I'm going to hand that to one of the techies.
So here's my 5 seconds of fame. So internally, within NZTA, service-to-service security is handled by X509 certificates. So we're using mutual certificate authentication. Outside from the website, we're planning to use OpenID Connect for OAuth 2.0 tokens.
So we're just at the point now, one of the projects has a requirement for an authentication service, and we're just in the design of that currently.
Thanks.
How many years before this last month we've been doing services with external companies, and how many? So this obviously is not the first one. So the 3 years period in which you sorted out the ESB project, but before that, for how long have you been doing SOA style stuff before you actually got it right?
So that was really 2 years ago when we took a change in direction and took the approach that we've talked about today. So the journey's 2 years so far.
But-
And they think sort of, 3 to 5 years to reach maturity.
There was web services and there've been some effort to start doing legacy wrappers, but it really wasn't the investment side of it, it was really tech.
So that those were not considered sovereignty.
No.
Yes, sir.
So you guys talked about moving to a more iterative approach at the same time as doing service orientation. What's the sort of relationship between the two, and were there any challenges doing both at the same time as opposed to sticking to your original process and service orientation?
So I think we've got still 2 kinds of projects that are running. So there are some that still fit very nicely in the traditional project delivery method, which is largely waterfall. However, the success of the projects that have got a service-oriented outcome kind of relies on that more iterative approach. So it's very much something that's fed into that process and its success.
Yeah, the successful projects have all been run as groups all together, design, build, the business side of it all happening, even if they were quite long and people had to come in from another place.
Sure.
You just mentioned that you have decomposed the payment services into smaller chunks of services, and you mentioned operational concerns. At what sort of granularity do you stop and consider services?
So it's really about making sure that each service has a very clear functional boundary. So payment, for example, shouldn't know anything about the providers with which it needs to interact. That's something provider can take care of. We don't bring any processing type logic into that payment capability. It's all about just that very true capability. So we've got, 5 services that we delivered. There was a process payment that handled sort of the workflow kind of things. There was the payment itself, so just the common elements about payment, an acquire payment to retrieve a history, a provider service which knew about our bank providers, our payment providers, and also a logging service. To support the payment process, we've also got a disbursement a service. The Transport Agency has a number of different revenue streams, and so if we're taking one payment for multiple revenue streams, we need a way of actually dispersing the funds to the appropriate revenue stream.
I think we
Do you see any performance degradation in doing SOA architecture? Because you've got many services and each service is interacting with other services, so you've got a network of services. And how does it impact on your performance rather than taking one of the applications?
So early on, this was one of the things that had to be considered. So one of the early proofs was that it could scale. So we just made it scale. We saw how far it would scale, and we saw what the conditions were for scaling. Hardware is not normally the limitation today. Design actually costs you a lot more than hardware. So there was a limit somewhere.
But we're also pressing the complexity into the lower levels.
Yeah.
So your presentation, for example, interacting with the task, those operations are actually pretty simple. So they can perform well. The complexity is pushed down into the lower layers.
And just fortunately, the non-functionals for performance for us were not that high for NZTA. So we could easily meet those.
So this is not a everything gets built this way strategy. The business really needs to identify the things that it needs to be reusable. So that's a dialogue that goes on, because this is you don't build everything as a reusable asset. And in fact, it's quite likely that there will never be more than, say, 40 real enterprise services. So this is about the thing. This is actually a way of building those reusable ones rather than a way of designing systems. There's quite a sharp distinction there.
And if you stick with the strong categorisation, so you make sure there's no business-specific logic sitting within your reusable services. So payment, for example, knows nothing about what tolling payments are. It only knows about payment. We push that up into the task level, the tolling-specific stuff.
So if you think about your business, no business has more than 40 or 50 true domain entities, and they're the candidates. Task services are not so reusable. Entity services tend to be very reusable if you're picking the core entities that your business deals with.
So those are some of the challenges that we're facing at the moment. So just as we've got this set of services currently, we've got a temporary repository for them. One of the challenges now moving into this environment where we're going to start to grow that inventory, we've got to work out how we're actually going to store these things. And like everything else, we're probably going to try out some stuff, see if it works for us, and work out what the best option is.
So we're pretty much out of time. But we're really happy to continue this dialogue outside. So Peter's going to stay around, and the rest of us are here tomorrow as well. But Peter's going to be around today. Grab us before you go if you'd like to keep the dialogue going. We actually, in our slide deck, we show the actual technologies we're using. So if you pull this down off the site, you'll actually see the stack in all its glory, versions and actual pieces. And then, all the usual good Microsoft stuff at the back here, including please say how wonderful we were. Thank you.